Thank you for that nice introduction, Fran. I will say that while I'm delighted to be here, as always, I've really kind of fallen in love with Georgia as a country, and I've made some very good friends, Fran included. I will say that this is the first time that I've done a keynote speech where I wasn't able to get dessert first. And so Fran makes you work as well as helps you understand the site. But I'm going to get dessert after this, Fran, if that's okay with you. As Fran said, I'm here to talk about several things tonight, about a lot of the words that are on the screen there. And is this translation thing working okay? It's on the table. Do people need that? I'm not sure if they need to be instructed in any way on this. No? Let's go ahead. Okay. So I'll be talking about interinstitutional cooperation, universities, partners, and policy development, and how do you put those all together. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey here, so bear with me. Especially if this doesn't work, you'll have to bear with me. You don't have to close that curtain. Well, Jason, running to the first button.
You went through the whole.
Am I done now?
Yeah.
Can I have dessert?
Yeah.
We're not getting any action. Pardon me. Is it off? Is it turned on? No. Okay. When in doubt, turn it on. It's an old trick. And there we go. Okay, let's see. Okay, we're in business now. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a bunch of different things. And this is a fair warning for those of you who are working in universities, Michael and others. I'm going to be pretty critical of the institution where I work because I think it needs to be reformed in a lot of ways in order to be a better partner to help society improve. Well, let's start with public policy, though. So, as I assert here, the long-term goal of public policy is to improve well-being. And you can come up with your own definitions and outlooks for public policy, but I think it's really very simple. Public policies should be made in an effort to help people become healthier, wealthier, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes this is expressed in these ways, to try to create, public policies are meant to create equity, efficiency, security, liberty, and wealth. Now, how do you do that? How do you choose among public policies? Because there are limited resources that you allocate. Public policy making is also about allocation of resources. And you only have so many resources, be they human, financial, and natural. Most people tend to think of policy resources as mostly financial. But I think it's very important to think of this more holistically and recognize that when you're allocating resources including people as well as natural resources. So, with this in mind, I would submit just for now, bear with me, because you can have your own surrogates, but there's one way that I like to measure effectiveness of resource allocation, and that is, does resource allocation end up creating wealth? Does it create economic well-being? It's not to say that money is everything, but money enables, the creation of wealth enables more resources to be channeled back into creating the outcomes you want as a policymaker, be they health outcomes or environmental outcomes or education outcomes, etc. So there's a surrogate measure, a way of measuring whether or not your allocation of resources, your public policy priorities, are actually resulting in the kinds of things that you want. Obviously, there's many other indicators, but for now, I'm going to suggest that this is one I'm just going to talk about tonight. Okay? Okay. So one of the policy targets that you have when you're trying to create wealth is economic advantage. Georgia, as other countries do, they want to be in an economically advantaged position. They want to be a competitor. They want to be a country of choice for foreign direct investment, for tourism, for creating wealth both in and out of the country, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of places and policymakers are stuck in what I would call the old measurement of economic competitiveness. The idea that low cost, for example, is a competitive advantage. China, for example, used to be a very low-cost place to manufacture. It's not as low cost anymore. Right now, there's an enormous amount of money that's not flowing into China as a result of the cost of its labor increasing. For the last 9 quarters, I believe, its foreign trade balance has actually decreased. It's still got basically all of the U.S. money, but not as much as they had before. And so on and so forth. And so, as you think about policies, as you think about institutional measures for creating the kinds of outcomes you want, especially within economic terms, it's important to start measuring things in new ways and thinking about things in new ways. And one of those things to think about in new ways is institutions, which I'll get to in a minute. So in a very important study that was done, it asked this question: what accounts for the economic well-being as measured in personal income between the rich countries and the poor countries? Okay? And this study examined a variety of factors: education, natural resources, etc. And was done by the International Monetary Fund and Harvard, some of the best researchers I know in applied economics. And does anyone know what the actual indicator, what accounted more than anything else for the well-being and the differences between rich and poor countries? The single indicator? Anyone take a guess? Come on, you
Income
catch
per
it, sir.
capita. Income per capita.
Institutions. The quality of the institutions in the country. Now that does include education, for example. The quality of the institutions was the single biggest predictor of whether or not a country was going to do well or not going to do well. It doesn't mean that the other things, natural resources and education, don't matter. They do matter. But ultimately, the single biggest predictor of economic well-being differences between rich and poor were the result of the quality of the institutions in that country, because they form the backbone of society. Now, institutions working together obviously create better public policies. When people come together from disparate perspectives, when institutions work hand in hand, they're more likely to create better public policies, in my opinion, in my experience. Unfortunately, institutions tend to work as silos. This is a little dramatic, this picture, I must say, but institutions tend to work on their own issues. And it doesn't mean that they can't be good partners. It means they have different missions. And one institution may have a mission related to foreign policy, and another related to health policy, and another related to social policy, and so on and so forth. So it is the case that institutions operating as silos, individually, without respecting one another, thinking of institutions and society, social well-being as a zero-sum game, are not going to be nearly as effective as when they work together. So what institutions, what am I talking about when I talk about institutions here? Well, I'm talking about the widest possible cut of institutions. Government institutions, both regional, national, and local, NGOs, think tanks, advocacy organizations, even private companies as institutions, and last, universities, which I'll talk about in particular in a moment. These are the kind of roster of institutions that typically work independent of one another or in opposition to one another. And I'm describing this in very broad terms. I recognize there are certainly exceptions to this rule, and some of you are exactly exemplify those things. But fundamentally, my experience is that most institutions, even inside most institutions, to partner with within institutions, often are working at cross purposes. Now let me turn as a sort of an example of how this can be reframed as the famous tragedy of the commons concept that Garrett Hardin, the economist, made so famous. That shared resources, in this case, let's just call it society, okay, when acted upon independently and rationally according to each one's self-interest, that's the silo, okay, deplete those resources. And if you're not familiar with this concept, I assume you are, it's very, very important. And one of the definitions that I like the most, which is a fairly recent one, is simply, in the tragedy of the commons, in this scenario where there's a shared resource, individuals, or in this case individual institutions, pursuing their own specific objectives can actually cause disastrous consequences. Even though they're acting very rationally, even though they're doing things and making decisions that are perfectly reasonable and perfectly rational, no one is taking care of the collective. No one is working together in this scenario. Fortunately, a few years ago, a woman named Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who I had the great fortune of working with over the last few years, she died this past year, won the Nobel Prize because she proved that the commons do not have to end in tragedy. She studied from the ground up successful examples of institutions working together on shared resources, trying to understand why those decisions that were made were so beneficial to everyone involved, even though there were different players. And I won't go into Eleanor's work except to kind of summarize where she came out, but she was a brilliant, capable person who defied much of the economics research of her time by doing the research in the field, working with farmers and NGOs, as well as governments and private organizations, to understand how cooperation could avoid the tragedy of the commons. And what she came out with is, in a very, very general way, because I'm summarizing her life's work here, is that institutional cooperation to avoid the tragedy of the commons requires a common set of problems. So there has to be some agreement that you're all trying to solve the same problem in the first place. A set of rules that govern the organizational interactions so that people understand when they're playing by the rules and when they're violating the rules. Assessments, taking stock of how things are going. Is the common area to be saved or to be preserved or to be used or to be shared or to be allocated? Is it being done in the way in which everyone agreed? Accountability, same kind of concept, and ultimately respect for one another. Okay. So what I wanted to do there is just simply lay the groundwork for what I'm going to talk about mostly, which is universities. Universities, by any measure, are an important public institution, an important partner when they partner well, okay, and certainly key to the transition of any society, be it Georgian or any other. So this brings us to the question of universities as institutional partners. And I only put this up here because this is me and part of my staff, and we just opened a cooperative agreement in the Netherlands with the municipality of Haarlemmermeer. And it's an example I'll come back to. This is the mayor of Haarlemmermeer, a municipality adjacent to Amsterdam. And I'll explain that as an example of institutional partnerships. Now, this is where if you love universities and you're not prepared to hear some criticism, this would be a good time to go and look outside and smoke a cigarette, because I'm about to dive into universities, which I have some great respect for and also some concern about. So I am painting here with a very broad set of perspectives. So universities and other institutions have very, very different perspectives, and you can put your own chart together. Universities tend to think of things in multiple years. People get degrees in 4 years or 6 years. Research studies can take 10 years, those kinds of things. Other public institutions often think in terms of a fiscal year or a problem that has to be solved right now. By comparison, the boundaries around universities are mostly exclusive. You've heard the term, I hope, ivory tower for universities, that they are, this is, I'm not going to offend you here, Michael, because I went to Ivy school too, but they tend to be exclusive. We are the smart people at the university, and then there's sort of everybody else, okay? And most other public institutions, governments, etc., when you represent a public institution, it's much more inclusive. You're trying to get input from your constituents as you operate against your objectives. And the primary missions are very, very different than most other organizations. University as an institution is actually, I think, mostly a very exclusive institution, even when they're public. We're a public institution in my own organization, Arizona State University, but we have a certain degree of exclusivity. Now, as a result, there's some real question about universities in the United States right now because of this exclusivity. Currently, and that's why I have a question mark here, the question is, what do people think about universities as institutions? They're coming into question in the U.S., and that's why I have the U.S. here. I'm not here to observe, criticize, or comment on Georgian universities. But the questions are ones of comparison. What is the status of the university? How does it operate as an institution? and what is actually needed for society to work, for the university as an institution to become a partner in improving the quality of life. And not to be too graphic between the jaguar and the turtle, but universities tend to move pretty slowly. They tend to be very compartmentalized. They tend to feel they own the truth. They're less likely to be flexible, and they tend to be very, very cautious. So how did universities get there? Now, this is one person's quick history lesson. I think that there are sort of 4 errors of universities. The first one is what I call the error of righteousness. And this is not meant to be negative, okay? I'm going to pick on my alma mater, Dartmouth College, which was founded over 200 years ago. And it was essentially founded in the woods of New Hampshire in the eastern part of the United States, basically to teach the native peoples of that area Christianity and to educate them. And so its motto was taken from the Bible. It was a righteous thing to do, to go into the woods and teach the Native Americans, the Indians, how to behave and how to learn and how to improve, etc., etc. So at that point, the institution was governed by, among other things, preachers and people of the church. They were very learned men that had a mission. At some point later, of course, the U.S. university system evolved quite a bit from righteousness into knowledge, into the creation of knowledge and the recognition that knowledge was power and is power. And much of the universities today are still in this era of the creation of knowledge, of what sometimes is referred to as basic research, is understanding how the world works, because that is important. And because knowledge now, because of globalization, because of the internet, because of democratization, can be brought all around the world. The knowledge can be shared very, very easily. But something has changed in the last 10 years or so to move the universities into what I call the era of innovation. That it was not simply enough to create knowledge, that we actually had to also use that knowledge to innovate, to find new ways of doing things, to find new technologies, new ways to transform society. And from that point, which is where we are now, between the era of knowledge and the era of innovation, there have some questions have arisen about what comes next for universities. As a result of this kind of thinking, if you're familiar with Thomas Friedman, who I think is great in New York Times, he said, well, universities are great and all, but increasingly, no one cares what you know, because you don't know it, you take this out, and you find out. I can come to Georgia or go to China or go back to the United States, and in 10 minutes, thanks to iPhones and Wikipedia, I've got knowledge. Now, I may not understand how to apply that knowledge, but knowledge as information is sitting right here, okay? And so this has brought into question not the creation or the importance of creating new knowledge, but how to access new knowledge, how to use new knowledge. And what Thomas Friedman says is basically people will care what you can do with your knowledge, with what you know. Which brings me to a question of where we are now in higher education as an institution. And I call it the era of integration, but with a question mark. And it's red because we're not sure, I'm not sure, if we're actually going to make this transition from righteousness and knowledge and even innovation to actually integrating fully with society. So this is a quote from my president, a person I work for and greatly admire. And he asked this question in 2006, and it has fundamentally reshaped the university where I work. Do you actually replicate, meaning other universities, what exists, or do you design what you need? Do you look at social, economic, and cultural problems that are not being met and make the university structure and mission and metrics and allocation of resources conform to the needs of the world, as opposed to get the needs of the world to conform to what you want to do as a university? And as a result of that, we've come up with something we call the design principles. And the design principles are meant to transform and reinvent the university to become a better able partner, to become a better able partner to work with other parts of society to improve the well-being of society, and as a result improve the quality of the university as a result. It is simply that the concept boiled down of moving from supply-side driven universities to demand-side universities. Supply-side economics, as you know, means one thing and demand-side is another. And in this case, supply-side means we have the knowledge and we're going to teach you. We're going to do the things we think are important for you as a student. Okay? The demand side says we're going to organize our teaching and our research around what is necessary in society, what is demanded of us to be a successful institutional partner. And I want to take you briefly through the principles, the design principles that now drive our university and which we share with other universities around the world, not because we are saying we're smart and you're not, we're doing the right thing and you're not, but we believe that these design principles make for stronger universities, make them able to better partner, and make them better problem solvers for society and the very society that feeds them. The first principle is to leverage your place, is to embrace the fact that there are local, cultural, institutional, and physical settings associated with where your university is that need to be taken into account. Okay? We live, for example, at Arizona State University in a desert, a really hot desert, as Fran explained before. Okay? Now, if we ignore the fact we live in a desert, we're not going to work on the very things that matter to people in the desert, basically, which is water. And how do you survive the heat? And where do you get enough energy to air condition? Because when it's 45 degrees centigrade, believe me, you want to have enough energy to air condition. Okay? And so embracing and recognizing where you are, that you don't stand apart from your setting culturally or institutionally, is the first design principle. The second is that we have a responsibility as universities to connect to urgent needs, to recognize the needs outside the walls of our university. I've worked with one university for a long time, a very prestigious university that I will not name, because I can be critical of my own university, but I won't publicly be critical of this one. We're a very wealthy university, surrounded by a big wall, okay? Right? Is almost completely ignorant of what's going on right outside the university, which is abject poverty, social decay, unbelievable. And the people who go to that university have a responsibility to recognize the needs outside the university. It doesn't compromise what they do or the quality of the research or their education, but to not recognize that they are living in a place that has urgent needs is irresponsible. Third principle is to value entrepreneurship. Now, most people think of entrepreneurship as making money, right? Well, entrepreneurship comes in lots of different forms. There's also something called civic entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship, creating new forms of exchange and new forms of ideas and new forms of application, okay? And we think that entrepreneurship and innovation need to go hand in hand, and that university is uniquely responsible for training people in that way. This next one is something that drives an awful lot of the work that I do in sustainability, which is conduct use-inspired research. Use-inspired research, which simply means if you're going to conduct research, conduct it on problems that matter. Be inspired by the things that will be used. This has been something that has been bothering me about universities for over 30 years. I see research, and once again, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but if I am, we'll talk about it later, after dessert. And that is, I've seen an awful lot of research that gets done for one reason and one reason only in the university, so that the instructor can become tenured. And that research often is not used. It's read by 4 other people somewhere where it has absolutely no utility. I'm not saying that basic research, the research that helps us understand the world, there's anything wrong with that. You need those building blocks of knowledge. But if you can do basic research on a problem that needs to be solved, that's inspired by the kinds of things we need to do that will be used, to me that's a higher calling. So pursuing research that has a purpose, pursuing research that can have impact, is something that can get you tenure and help solve the world's problems. The next is enabling access for all. Okay? We like to think at Arizona State, at least, that we are measured by the people we include in our student body, not the measure of people we exclude. And this was something that was hard for me to get my own head around when I was a regular faculty member, not administrator. Why? Because I wanted the best students. I wanted the students who had been best trained and the best writers and the smartest students, etc. And often, those were the students who were privileged. Those are the students who had the highest marks and the most money and came from the best backgrounds, etc. I learned later on that it was a responsibility, certainly of a public university, to create an opportunity for all people to succeed. People from different backgrounds, different colors, different creeds, different religions, etc., etc. This next one is something that you would think would be simple, and it's extremely difficult. Because just like institutions are often in silos, there is often no greater silo than a department at a university. This department doesn't talk to that department, that doesn't talk to that department. The former president of my university once described Arizona State University as a group of separate fiefdoms only connected by a common heating and cooling system. And he was right. He was right. So we've broken down barriers. We've broken down barriers. For example, we no longer have a biology department or a chemistry department. We don't have those. We have a school of life sciences where biologists and ecologists and geochemists work together in a common way. We literally destroyed the barriers. We broke down the silos and we began to work together to fuse intellectual disciplines. One of the most shocking things to me when we started doing this was I would go to meetings and I would say, you know, Michael, you know, meet Stephen. And they'd never spoken to each other. And then we find out they'd both been at the university for 30 years. It's like, how could that be possible? Well, when you don't mix your disciplines, that's what happens. People get siloed. It becomes socially embedded. This is something that's been a challenge for universities. For a while in the United States, there was something called service learning, which meant you went into the community and you served. That's a little different than I'm talking about before. Community connection should be partnerships, where both the community benefits. Here's an example of some people we helped organize a community garden, okay? Essentially an old age and assisted living home. And we had our students go out and help them to create this community garden, which was very important, very meaningful to the people who lived in this place. But my students got the experience of working with elderly, got the experience of working with poor people that they hadn't had, got the experience of actually putting their knowledge and skills to work in terms of building organic gardens and creating foodstuffs and things like that. So there's a way to learn outside of the walls of the community, of the university community. And lastly, to engage globally, which is of course one of the things I'm doing here. Recognizing that the problems that happen locally are global and the problems that happen global are local as well. And so in my college right now, I'm moving toward a very expensive proposition where I don't intend to let any of my graduate students finish their work in master's and doctoral programs without spending a semester in another country. It's an enormously expensive proposition. So I'm raising money from organizations that I tell, how can we possibly solve the problems of the world when all of our experience solving problems is in Arizona? We can't do that anymore. So let me turn for just a minute with those design principles in mind. Ones that we at Arizona State are doing, but we hope that others take these into consideration. And let me just give you just a simple example of applying those principles in the context of public policy. So prior to the work I'm doing now, I ran the Morris Institute for Public Policy, which is a think tank at our university. It was very well known in Arizona, not as well known outside of Arizona, and I ran this for quite a while. And I took into consideration these design principles when we chose our projects. And so you'll see at the top of these next 4 slides, those design principles, and then inside the body of the slide, you'll see how we actually applied them. So when we chose the research that we wanted to do, and all of our research was external funded, project-based research, just like a lot of the NGOs who represent the kinds of issues that you're concerned with who are in this room. We were project-driven a lot. We had some institutional backing, but mostly we were project-driven. But we always kept thinking, first and foremost, how do we ensure that the research we conduct is going to be used? Not just who can pay for it and how much can they pay for it. And so we always engaged in the outside, because we didn't know what would be used unless we asked the constituents. So whether it was asking government officials, what are the issues that you need to know more about in order to conduct your policy business, whether it was involving the community and actually shaping the research and getting information, or whether it was going to businesses and trying to anticipate if we conducted policy analysis and came up with policy recommendations, was that going to be obstructionist or interfere with the success of business? So we always use the lens of use-inspired research when we decided to do a piece of work. And my colleagues thought I was crazy when I would turn down opportunities to do work that I just didn't think would be ultimately used because there were financial incentives. We always worked across disciplines. And the way we did that was I kept a very small staff of full-time people, and then I dipped into the talent pool of the university as I had need for the talent. So we were often working where we would have someone who would be a central manager of the policy project at the institute. They were a staff member of mine, okay? And then we would hire an architect from the architecture faculty, an engineer from the engineering faculty, and an economist from the School of Business, and together we would work on a project. In that case, it would have been some sort of infrastructure project. So we always mixed and matched these disciplines, and we became very well known for that because we were not working within, once again, our own silo. We also tried to think very, very hard about how do you transform society. And these were some examples of just some of the reports, and each of them have different titles. And what's important here is to recognize, and I said this to a group of some of the people in the room the other day when we were at this think tank colloquium, is that it's really important to be able, if you want to transform society, to understand how to actually connect with society. Because universities, and sometimes think tanks, often write wonderfully thoughtful analysis that no one but them can understand. So what you see here is, for some of you who I was talking to about the other day, look at the covers. Do these look like university research reports? Most of what I see for research reports are kind of dull little wordy things, and it's like I'm asleep after page one, right? So we started working with colors and graphics, and we were doing stuff on the internet and videotapes and things long before that was popular, not because we were so creative and innovative. We were just trying to figure out how do you actually get people to use the research, how do you transform their thinking? And the first thing we realized is we have to start communicating differently. So we started doing big print and simple language and stuff that people could understand, even though our research always would adhere to the canons of scholarship and objectivity. And then the last thing, what we did is we always tried to connect with community. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the things we put in place that I raised funds for. Remember, the connect to community, use-inspired research, transform society. These are all the principles that I am suggesting can transform the university into a better partner. So we had 3 projects that became our signature project. One was called Arizona Policy Choices. This was something that I never allowed any sponsor to fund. It was completely independent. I would raise money from giving speeches and bake sales and selling pencils and whatever I had to do to pick one topic a year that the constituents in Arizona thought was the single most important policy facing the state that year. And so what we would do is we would do a completely independent report that would reflect on what are the choices that Arizonans face. So what you see here is actually the governor of Arizona, Janet Napolitano, who's now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, receiving, I don't know which report she received, because she was the person who we delivered this to as the chief policymaker for the state. The ASU Community Fellows Program was a program where I decided that all us smart people in the university didn't know as much as we thought. And what we did was, instead of bringing in scholars as fellows, we brought in community organizers. We brought in people who lived on the street. We brought in people who were advocates, who were not PhDs, were not scholars. And we brought them to our university, and they gave lectures, and they talked, and they interacted with students, and they had lunch with faculty members, etc. And these we called community fellows, because they came from the community. We gave them a stipend, we gave them an office, we treated them with respect. And the idea is we said, you teach us what we don't know about how policy works. on the ground level, on the street. And that has gone on for about 15 years now. And my favorite one is this one, the Young Stewards of Public Policy. What we did is we asked high school social studies teachers to ask their students to write a one-page essay. And the essay was on a policy that they wanted to see actually take place, to be enacted in the state of Arizona. Okay? The winners were rewarded with a scholarship to Arizona State University that we raised money for, and also with the guarantee of being published in the largest newspaper in the state. So if you won this award, you got a scholarship and you were published instantly. And I will tell you that some of the best pieces of policy analysis I've ever seen done were done by 16 and 17-year-olds, because they spoke with a passion about policy that was very different from those of us who have been trained in these particular manners of doing things. I just wanted to, I'm going to finish up just here in a moment, but I wanted to share with you this as examples of how I, at least as one person, tried to make my institution, my unit, my think tank, a better partner with other institutions, working with community leaders, working with governments, working with NGOs, by following some of these design principles. And let me leave you with this, that if you aspire to be a better institutional partner, you will be. The other day when I was in the room with the think tanks, there's a few things that were very noticeable to me, which I didn't share with you at the end of the day for those of you who are here. So the setting is that we were in another hotel, and there were, I don't know, 11, 12, 13, 14 think tanks, NGOs involved, and some donors, and we're discussing issues and how things work. And there was an enormous amount of talent in this room. You have an enormous amount of talent here in Georgia, really smart people who are passionate about this country and where it's going and making a transition to succeed. I can't tell you how impressed I am. But there were also people in the room who were in their silos. There were also people in the room who were in their silos. And what you can accomplish together, if you aspire to do that, will be much, much greater than if you stay in those silos. And with that, I thank you very much.